Some people don't stay single for very long. When one relationship ends, another begins soon after, sometimes before the previous one has really ended. To an outside observer, this might look like coincidence, emotional intensity, or even luck in love. Psychologically, though, it's rarely any of those things. There's a specific kind of restlessness that shows up when these people are alone. It's not ordinary loneliness, it's a deeper discomfort, almost physical, as if silence exposes something that needs to be immediately drowned out. In this context, relationships stop being a choice and become a refuge. What's most interesting is that many of these people aren't desperate for love. They're trying to avoid something much harder to face: direct contact with themselves. Being alone for them doesn't just mean the absence of company, it means losing a mirror, an emotional regulator, a narrative that helps hold together who they are. That's why they adapt too quickly, give in too soon, stay in places where they no longer feel seen. The relationship becomes a form of psychological stability, not necessarily intimacy. This video isn't about judging people who are always in relationships. It's about understanding what's really at stake when someone feels that being alone isn't an option, and how that quietly shapes the way they love, choose, and stay. As the video unfolds, this logic will become clearer, and you may recognize patterns you've never connected before. The difficulty of being alone rarely shows up as an obvious problem. Most of the time, it's disguised as something socially acceptable. People who fall in love quickly, who get attached easily, who seem emotionally available all the time. From the outside, this is often interpreted as intensity, romanticism, or a strong need for connection. On the inside, the dynamic is usually very different. For someone who can't tolerate being alone, a relationship isn't just an emotional bond. It functions as an organizing axis for their inner life. Their mood, their identity, and often their sense of self-worth are regulated through the other person. The we forms before the I is ever clearly defined. This pattern doesn't come out of nowhere. It develops when someone learns over the course of life that being in a relationship feels safer than being with themselves. Inner silence starts to feel threatening. Time alone doesn't feel like rest. It feels like exposure. And anything that exposes tends to be avoided. That's why these people often confuse attachment with emotional stability. They don't enter relationships only out of desire, but out of a need for containment. The other person becomes a kind of psychological anchor. When that anchor is lost, the inner world feels like it falls apart along with it. This helps explain why the end of a relationship is often experienced as something bigger than a breakup. It's not just the loss of a partner. It's the loss of a structure that helps support daily life, decisions, and self-esteem. The urgency to find someone new doesn't come from a lack of love, but from an attempt to restore that lost balance. Another key aspect is the difficulty of distinguishing discomfort from danger. For these people, the discomfort of being alone is interpreted as something that must be eliminated immediately. Instead of being experienced as a temporary state, it's treated as a sign that something is wrong, and the relationship appears as a quick solution. Over time, this creates a predictable pattern. The person adapts too much in order not to lose the bond. They tolerate situations that aren't good for them. They silence their discomfort. They adjust their expectations, not because they don't notice boundaries being crossed, but because the fear of being alone weighs more than the discomfort of staying. There's also a frequent confusion between presence and intimacy. Being with someone all the time doesn't mean being emotionally close, but for someone who can't tolerate solitude, simple physical presence already provides enough relief. The relationship fills the space that would otherwise feel empty, even if there's no deep exchange. This doesn't mean these people don't know how to love. Many of them love intensely. The problem is that love comes mixed with emotional dependence. The bond stops being a space of meeting and becomes a space of support. And when a relationship takes on that role, it becomes heavy for both the one leaning and the one being leaned on. There's also a quiet cost to this pattern: the difficulty of developing emotional autonomy. When someone moves from one relationship to another without spending time alone, they lose the chance to process losses, understand patterns, and build a clearer relationship with themselves. Each new bond begins without the previous one ever being fully integrated. Psychology observes that learning to be alone isn't about learning to isolate yourself. It's about learning to stay in contact with yourself without needing to numb that contact through another person. When that doesn't happen, relationships turn into tools for emotional survival, not conscious choices. And that's where the problem deepens. The more a relationship is used to avoid encountering oneself, the less space there is for real intimacy. The other person becomes too necessary to be seen clearly, and the relationship, instead of strengthening, begins to limit. This pattern isn't easily recognized because it looks like love, but psychologically it says more about fear than about choice. Fear of silence, fear of emptiness, fear of discovering who you are when no one else is occupying that space. And it's from this point that understanding begins to deepen. Before we move on, a quick invitation. If this topic already made you think of someone or of yourself, leave a comment. You don't need to explain too much. Sometimes naming it is enough. and leave a like if you enjoy content like this. Now let's continue. There's a common belief that people who can't be alone are simply needy or emotionally fragile. That reading is simplistic and often wrong. What usually sits behind this behavior isn't a lack of emotional strength, but an unresolved relationship with one's own identity when it isn't being reflected by someone else. For many of these people, relationships function as a constant mirror. It's through the other person's gaze that they recognize themselves, organize themselves, and feel real. When that mirror disappears, a sense of disorientation emerges. Not knowing where to go feels less frightening than not knowing who you are without someone constantly confirming it. This helps explain why the beginning of relationships often feels so intense. It's not just excitement, it's relief. The presence of the other quiets internal noise, provides structure, creates an immediate narrative where together starts answering questions the person can't answer on their own. The problem is that this relief comes at a cost. The more identity depends on the bond, the less room there is for disagreement. Disagreeing starts to feel like a threat. Frustrating the other person feels like a risk of abandonment. And little by little, the person begins to shape their behavior, desires, and even opinions to keep the relationship stable. This process isn't always conscious. Often, the person believes they're just being flexible, understanding, mature. But internally, they drift further away from themselves. The fear of being alone turns into a fear of disappointing. And the relationship stops being a space of exchange and becomes a space of emotional containment. There's also a significant difficulty with tolerating pauses. People who can't be alone tend to fill every gap with external presence. The time between relationships is experienced as an unbearable void. Instead of being a period of reorganization, it becomes something to get through as quickly as possible. This prevents losses from being processed. Emotions remain suspended. Conclusions aren't reached. Each new relationship begins carrying remnants of the previous one, creating emotional overlap that further blurs the line between genuine desire and the need not to be alone. Psychology observes that learning to be alone doesn't mean enjoying solitude all the time. It means being able to stay with yourself without panicking, without running outward, without turning another person into anesthesia. When this capacity doesn't develop, relationships start fulfilling a role they were never meant to fulfill. They stop being encounters and become emotional regulation, and that creates relationships that are intense but unstable, close but not very honest, full of presence but with little inner space. Recognizing this pattern isn't an accusation, it's a starting point. Because only when someone realizes they're not looking for another person but avoiding themselves does something begin to change. And that change doesn't happen all at once. It starts with small acts of tolerance, staying a little longer in silence, holding discomfort without escaping, noticing the impulse to fill the space with someone else. It's in that space, uncomfortable but revealing, that emotional autonomy begins to form. That's where a relationship with another person can finally stop being a necessity and start becoming a choice. When someone can't be alone, something important happens inside their relationships. The boundary between wanting and needing begins to disappear. And that confusion completely changes the dynamic of the bond. The other person stops being someone you share life with and becomes someone who sustains your emotional life. At that point, the relationship starts carrying a role it was never meant to carry. It has to calm, validate, fill, distract, give meaning. And when a relationship takes on all of these functions at once, any instability is experienced as a threat. Small absences take on excessive weight. The other person's mood shifts are read as danger signals. The bond stops being a space for exchange and turns into a constant alert system. This helps explain why these people often get involved in relationships marked by emotional intensity, not because they're seeking drama, but because intensity creates a feeling of presence. It fills the inner space that would otherwise fall silent. Conflicts, quick reconciliations, intense declarations, these keep the bond active, pulsing, visible. The problem is that intensity isn't intimacy, and over time, it comes at a cost. There's also a real difficulty in sustaining desire when the fear of being alone is in control. Desire presupposes freedom. It involves risk, curiosity, choice. When a relationship is lived as a necessity, desire tends to turn into attachment. The person stays not because they want to be there, but because they can't tolerate the idea of not being there. This pattern often creates long relationships that are emotionally shallow. There is togetherness, there is presence, but little room for individuality. The we becomes a fusion, and in fusions, no one can really breathe. Fear of separation blocks honest conversations. Truths are postponed, dissatisfactions are softened. Everything is done to keep the bond intact. Over time, a paradox emerges. The person is accompanied yet feels increasingly distant from themselves. They have someone beside them but lose clarity about what they want, what they feel, what they can tolerate. The relationship offers company but weakens inner contact. And that distance from the self creates discomfort that, ironically, reinforces the fear of being alone even more. Another common effect is difficulty ending relationships that no longer make sense. A breakup isn't experienced only as the loss of the other, but as a loss of ground. The person doesn't just fear the partner's absence, but the emotional collapse they imagine will follow. So they stay, they justify, they reinterpret signals, they postpone decisions. Staying becomes less painful than facing the emptiness they imagine exists outside the relationship. Psychology shows that this fear doesn't come from solitude itself, but from unfamiliarity with one's own inner world. For those who never learn to listen to themselves without external distractions, silence feels dangerous. Not because it harms, but because it reveals. This is where many people realize something uncomfortable. Difficulty being alone isn't about too much love, but about too little intimacy with oneself. The less contact a person has with their own emotions, the more they depend on another to regulate them. This doesn't mean relationships are a mistake. On the contrary, relationships are essential. The problem arises when they become the only possible source of emotional stability, when there isn't a sufficiently livable self outside the we. Learning to be alone doesn't require isolation or radical rupture. It requires presence. It requires tolerating moments of discomfort without immediately turning them into a search for someone else. It requires observing impulses instead of obeying them. This process is slow, sometimes uncomfortable, but deeply transformative. When a person begins to tolerate their own company, something changes in how they relate to others as well. The other stops being an emotional crutch and becomes a choice. The bond gains more truth, less fear. And the relationship stops being a place to escape from oneself and becomes a place where one can show up whole. That's the point where the relationship can finally breathe. At some point, this pattern starts to become visible to the person living it, not as a sudden revelation, but as a series of small discomforts that keep repeating. They notice how much they change depending on who they're with, that certain decisions only make sense as long as there's someone sharing the weight of them. That when the relationship goes into crisis, everything else seems to collapse with it. She says this is a delicate moment because it touches self-image. For many people, recognizing that they can't be alone feels like admitting weakness, as if emotional autonomy were a skill everyone should naturally have. But the truth is, this capacity isn't innate. It's built. And for many people, there was never space to build it. People who struggle to be alone often learned sooner or later that connection comes before self-understanding, that personal value is confirmed through attachment, that being chosen feels safer than choosing. This creates a quiet dependence on the other's gaze, not an explicit need for approval, but a constant need for external reference. The problem isn't wanting to be seen. We all do. The problem is only feeling real when someone is there to confirm it. In that scenario, the relationship stops being an exchange and becomes a form of support. And emotionally supporting someone all the time is a weight no relationship can carry without consequences. Over time, this way of functioning creates a kind of exhaustion that's hard to name. The person feels like they're always adjusting, always giving a little more, always anticipating reactions, not because the other explicitly demands it, but because fear of loss has become an internal regulator. The relationship is lived with vigilance, not presence. There's also a significant effect on partner choice. People who can't tolerate being alone tend to get involved with those who offer quick emotional predictability, someone available, intense, consistent. This can create very close relationships at first, but fragile ones in the medium term. The closeness is born from need, not real compatibility. This pattern also makes it harder to recognize when something isn't working. Discomfort is often reinterpreted as just a phase, fear of commitment, or being too demanding. So the person learns to negotiate with themselves to avoid facing the possibility of being alone. And with each internal negotiation, they move a little further away from their own limits. The central point here isn't to condemn this behavior, but to understand it. Because no one stays in this pattern by conscious choice. It's an adaptation, a way to survive emotionally in contexts where being alone felt too threatening. The risk appears when this adaptation stops being questioned, when the relationship becomes the only possible place of stability, when the idea of being alone is automatically associated with abandonment, failure, or emptiness. Psychology shows that healthier relationships begin to form when a person learns to separate discomfort from danger. Being alone can be uncomfortable, but it isn't necessarily threatening. That distinction changes everything. It allows silence to stop being the enemy. It allows time alone to stop being something to avoid. When this shift begins, something reorganizes internally. The person starts to realize they can miss someone without collapsing, that they can desire without losing themselves, that they can be in a relationship without disappearing inside it. This isn't a fast process, but it is a possible one, and it transforms not only the relationship with others, but most importantly, the relationship with oneself, which is where everything begins. Learning to be alone isn't about learning to like solitude. It's about learning not to run away from yourself. That distinction changes everything. Because the real problem was never the absence of someone else. It was the difficulty of staying in contact with your own inner world without immediately trying to fill it. When a person begins to tolerate that contact, something important starts to reorganize. Silence stops feeling like a threat and starts becoming information. Discomfort loses its sense of urgency. Instead of rushing outward, the person begins to observe what's happening inside, and that observation, even when it doesn't bring immediate answers, restores a sense of autonomy. Little by little, relationships stop being a place of emotional survival and become a place of genuine connection again. The other person no longer has to regulate everything. They don't need to constantly confirm who you are. Presence is no longer required to avoid emptiness. It becomes something you want by choice. This deeply changes the way someone relates. Conversations become more honest. Boundaries become clearer. The fear of disappointing others loses its grip. The person begins to realize they can be seen without constantly reshaping themselves, that they can disagree without it meaning abandonment, that they can be alone without disappearing. This process doesn't turn someone into an independent person in a rigid sense. It turns them into a more whole person. And whole people relate differently. They don't enter relationships to be saved, but to share. They don't stay out of fear, but out of genuine affinity. They don't confuse intensity with connection. Perhaps the most liberating realization is this: learning to be alone doesn't push love away. It refines it. Relationships stop being a place of compensation and become a space where two people can exist without canceling themselves out. For those who have always been in relationships, this shift can feel scary at first, but it doesn't require dramatic breakups or radical changes. It asks for something simpler and harder at the same time. Presence with your impulses, presence with discomfort, presence with silence. It's in that space that something new begins to form. A more honest relationship with yourself. And from that, relationships that are lighter, more genuine, and far less driven by the fear of being alone. Before we close, here's a final invitation. If this topic resonated with you, leave a comment. It can be an experience, a question, or just a sentence that stayed with you. Reading what you think helps keep this space alive and shows that these reflections don't happen in a vacuum.